So Eden, I'm so glad you're here to join me this morning. I often refer to this story as Jesus' first sermon to his home congregation. And I know this is probably the first time that you've been involved in a sermon, so I hope you get a better response than he does. Yeah. The band's going to promise not to throw her off a cliff.
That's comforting. I feel better.
So that's good. I'm glad you feel comforted by that. I'm always struck, having preached for close to 30 years, some idea of what makes a good or challenging sermon. And I basically give Jesus some mixed reviews. He does good. He picks a text that is familiar to lots of people. He does really good in making the sermon short and sweet. That is really important. But then he makes a rookie mistake in that he doesn't know when to end, which results in him again being run out of town, forced to a cliff, about to be thrown out over the cliff. I have never had that response in a sermon, I can tell you. And as I thought about that, I said, you know what? That may not be a good thing. That just may not be a good thing. So the text that Jesus reads to the congregation, he comes home to his hometown in Nazareth. The text he reads is from a passage of Isaiah, and it's a beautiful text. It's a very meaningful text, a very inspiring text, I think. It says, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives, recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." And then he rolls up the text, hands it to the attendant, and then says his sermon is just one line: "Today this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing." And the congregation loves it. They're cheering him on. They're saying, can this truly be the son of Joseph? You know, he's really impressive. Joseph's got to be proud for sure. But then Jesus goes to meddling. And it may be odd to our ears, but he tells two stories he reminds them of two prophets in two stories, Elijah and Elisha. And in both of those stories, he recounts how God's grace, God's healing, God's abundance came to people who were not considered the holy people. That came to those who were considered outside the tribe of Israel. One to a widow, and another to a Syrian who was healed. And you, as we talked this week, you commented that you noticed something that I hadn't really been hit by. You noticed something in this text that kind of alarmed you a little bit.
Well, right. When you first sent it to me, the part that really surprised me was that God only chose those two people. So he completely excluded what we consider to be the chosen people. So until we talked, I was stuck on that. Like, I get that he was extending to outsiders, but he excluded all of these people. So I was trying to, again, like you, figure out why they were so angry, because all of those things he said were good, scary maybe. We're going to open the prisons and let them go, but a good thing. Mm-hmm. But I thought, okay, maybe it's this fear, this exclusionary thing that, oh, wait, if he'd chosen one here and then the widow or the Syrian or something like that, maybe it would have been softer. Maybe they wouldn't have gotten him all the way to the cliff. They would have just taken him out of the church. I don't know.
Just kicked him out of the church,
right,
not threatened to throw him over the cliff. Yeah, and I was struck by that. I hadn't really noticed that in the text, that it intentionally says he healed, or Elijah and Elisha intentionally healed only those outside the tribe. Right. And so I thought about that, and what struck me is I was reminded of Jesus saying, "I come only for the sick." Right. That Jesus in particular is one who has reached out to the least of these to connect to those who were considered outside God's grace, even to the exclusion of God's chosen people.
So
and
by
you talk
doing
about
that,
something that's pretty offensive, right?
Right. And by doing that, it makes his message so much more clear.
Right.
Like, you can't get muddled in. Like, if he had done a few of the chosen people and then these other ones, they would have maybe said it's a mistake.
Right.
He like forgot.
Well,
that
grace
they're not.
spilled over
Yeah,
or
it spilled
something.
over. That's right. It's one of those things. But by choosing just those two, it's hard to ignore.
And
they didn't ignore it.
Thank you for that, because I had not really noticed that as well. And you said this a little bit earlier. I'm always struck about why we get so angry about the idea that God's grace can extend to those who are outside our group or what we expect. And I tried to think about why. I mean, that's pretty angry to run you out of town.
Right.
To
and
be
his
so
hometown,
offended.
not
in his
just any
hometown.
town.
People who cared about
They loved him a minute ago, and now it's like, ugh, we're done.
So I was struck by that what is it that makes us so angry? And some ideas I had was, well, in many ways, I think because we think we've earned our salvation. We've said the right words, we've done the right things, we've gone to session meetings. Mm-hmm. That'll earn you points in heaven for sure.
It will, definitely.
Make you one of the holy ones. That idea that salvation is something that we've worked hard for, and we go to church and we do the right things, and therefore we deserve it, and there are those people who don't deserve it.
Well, and I think along those lines, if we think that way, it's like a checklist. So I went to so many things, check, I'm there, I'm good, I've earned my A, life goes on.
Right.
And so if you take that checklist away from me, I'm uncertain. How do I get there? What do I need to do? How can I control it?
That's really a good point. It also strikes me that conversely, we kind of think those who are in prison, those imprisoned, whether they be literally in prison for some act and or prison of poverty or addiction, that they actually kind of deserve their imprisonment. They've made mistakes, and therefore they don't deserve, in many ways, God's grace to be extended to them. And I can see that it's both a sense of my own salvation and also a sense those people don't deserve. They're wrong. They're bad people.
And I think with that kind of attitude, again, we're always trying to find our internal bearing, our sense in the world. And it's tragic, and Jesus is trying to teach us that everything's equal, but we don't like that. Human nature is such that we have to juggle, we have to try to put ourselves above somebody else. So if somebody's in prison, clearly they're a bad person.
Right.
That one's a done deal. It's just, they're in prison, we're done. Not that they deserve any kind of sympathy or anything, because society has decided, and back in Jesus' time, widows were excluded, Syrians were excluded. So that just made the hierarchy easy to understand. It's not right, and he's trying hard to buck that, but in today's society, we still do the same thing.
Right.
Politically.
In fact, a church member shared with Teresa and me this past week an article from NPR called "The End of Empathy," and I need to look up her name. There's a researcher named Sarah Conrath. She's out of Indiana University, and they've been studying empathy out of Indiana University for a long time, and they would ask students their agreement with these. Part of that was asking students their agreement with two statements, and the statements were, "It's not really my problem if others are in trouble and need help," as a measurement of empathy. Mm-hmm. Obviously, people who have more empathy would say it is their problem.
Right.
And then the other statement is, "Before criticizing somebody, I try to imagine how I would feel if I were in their place." Obviously, an idea of empathy, of being able, even with those that we may not know quite well, a capacity to be able to walk in their shoes, so to speak. And they have discovered this alarming trend. They've been studying this for decades. And since the year 2000...
20 years ago.
Yeah, 20 years ago, They have discovered that and since then, there's been a decline of about 40% in empathy. And I was struck by that. We tend to think of empathy as a kind of human capacity, just inborn, but I wonder what that says about what do we teach or how do we see ourselves in the world. The other part of that article that was so fascinating, that really struck me, was the observation that the truth is now we define empathy in terms of which tribe we are a part of. That in fact, we use empathy to decide who's going to be part of our tribe. So we'll identify with someone who thinks like us or looks like us. We'll have empathy for them as opposed to and over against someone who's part of another tribe, someone who's outside the group. That in fact, we think of empathy as something extend to those who deserve it, and we won't extend empathy, most especially to those we think are wrong. And I think that's so true. I laugh because I think I see that kind of tribal empathy every time, twice a year, when I see the Green Bay Packers play the Minnesota Vikings.
Right.
I have no empathy for those Vikings fans. I'm sorry, I just don't. So.
Even when a player's injured.
Right.
Yeah, it doesn't extend to that, right? Player on the opposite team.
So I was really struck by that this week.
It's alarming. And maybe one of the things that's happening now with this global pandemic is that maybe we're going to learn that we're all human. Around the globe, we've talked about the internet and global commerce and global everything, and now we're seeing something that is affecting every single human regardless of what tribe they're in.
Right.
So maybe this, because it is sad to think in 20 years there's been a 40% reduction in empathy in college students. That's who they're studying there.
Right.
But they're going to be the adults of the world. And this, it's not my problem, this individualistic society, you can't imagine anything good coming out of this pandemic, and yet that might be something to help us with our empathy.
Yeah, I think you're right on, Eden. I think that's part of the good news of this text, is the sense of that we're in this together, and that maybe it will shatter some of those barriers to empathy, that we can't dismiss those, because we're all, in a way, we're all living in prisons. Yeah. We're the self-quarantine. It feels like imprisonment at times.
It does.
And so that raises interesting questions about what is the good news for us in this text. What is it about this text that can be meaningful, about feeling imprisoned, and yet Jesus saying, one day you will be set free, and I'm so looking forward to that day.
That day.
I know
when
that.
you can have a congregation again.
Right.
That will be nice.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, I know, Eden, you and I talked a little bit about this, that one of the prisons you identified for yourself was about grief. And your husband passed away how many years ago? 8 years ago. 8 years ago. Share some of what you shared with me.
Well, that's interesting, because I didn't identify it for myself. You're being very kind. You identified it for me. And that when you said that, because we were talking about metaphorical prisons aside from the literal prisons with the chains on, we've got addiction. I love the fact that you said hate, because that goes back to this idea of empathy. The people who are imprisoned through their hatred of other tribes are in prison, but they don't know it. But when you mentioned grief, it was like a light bulb went on for me, because I thought, I don't want to insult Alex, but I don't think, grief is really in prison. And immediately I was struck on the literal level that when Mark died, he died suddenly of a heart attack on a Sunday night. And we were ironically going to church for a church youth program. And so your life is just completely upended, obviously. And we'd been married 34 years at the time, and we had 4 kids, and the youngest kid was 14. And for 3 months, we lived on a farm in East Peru. Peru, we say, not Peru, Peru. Okay. And it was southeast of Winterset. I did not leave the farm. So, that was a self-imposed prison because, and I'm in a widows group, and I've talked with a lot of other widows and widowers. I just shorten it to widows because it's easier. But we felt exposed and vulnerable. And I don't know why that is. I'm not a psychologist. I have no idea. But everyone has experienced that feeling. So to kind of protect ourselves, we didn't go anywhere. If somebody wanted to talk to me, they had to come out to the farm, and it's a long drive. It's a forever drive. And I would leave, and I would take the 14-year-old into her cheerleading practice or whatever, but I never left the confines of my car. And one time, this is in Winterset, I saw a longtime friend, member of the Presbyterian Church. We raised our kids together. She was my kid's kindergarten teacher. So, it goes way back with this woman, and she was walking towards me. I was actually out of my car, and I felt incredibly vulnerable. And she was walking towards me with sympathy in her face, and I knew she wanted to offer me comfort. But I couldn't take it. I just turned around, scuttled back to my car, and drove away. I mean, how rude is that? It's the rudest thing ever.
Totally understand.
But I think that if you think of grief as a prison, which was a great metaphor, it takes a long time to come out of it. But with my widows group, when we had talked earlier this week, I just had a virtual coffee, a Zoom coffee with the widows. We usually get together, obviously, in person, and now we're doing it virtually with our tea and coffee. But it's comforting where we are now in our grief journey, and some are 10 years out, some are 2 years out. It's all different ages or lengths of time. It's that we have made it through. It's not the same. I wish the spouses were back with us, but it's a very happy feeling that we got through those darkest days. So I do think there's light at the end of the tunnel. People tell you that when it happens, and you can't believe it.
You can't believe it,
No.
and totally understandable. But it also sounds like one of the paths to being released from that prison was that other people
definitely
were part of that.
Yes, and it has to be people who've experienced the same thing. So not being terribly familiar with the 12-step program or AA, but I think the concept there is the same, where the people sitting in the group have experienced the same kind of thing. So they can empathize because they've been in those shoes. So it makes empathy easier. And when you're trying to break an addiction, it's not somebody saying, oh, just don't drink. Oh, just don't eat that piece of cake. Oh, just don't do that. It's a lot harder, when it's yours.
So you sharing that this week reminded me of one of my favorite stories, and we'll end with this. Okay. It's a story of a man walking down a street. And he falls into a hole, stumbles into a hole. The sides are too steep. He can't climb out of the hole. And so he's very desperate to get out of this hole. And a doctor walks by and he yells out, "Hey, doc, could you help me out here? Could you get me out of this hole?" And the doc writes out a prescription and throws it down into the hole. And then a priest walks by, and the guy says, hey, Father, could you help me out here? I'm stuck in this hole and I can't get out. And the priest takes a piece of paper and writes a prayer and throws it down into the hole. And finally, a friend comes by, and the guy in the hole says, "Hey, Joe, could you help me out? Could you help me out here?" And his friend says, "Sure," and he jumps into the hole. And this guy looks at his friend, "Jojo, why'd you do that? Now we're both stuck here." And his friend said to him, "My friend, I've been in this hole before, and I know a way out."
It's the best.
Amen.
Amen.
So.